All right. So here's your bottom line up front for Fire Away, episode 53. Men, this is an episode directed at you, so pay attention. Catholic man up. That's right. I said it, and I said it before in previous episodes, and I'll say it again in this episode and future episodes. Be a man. Not just any man, but a true Catholic man. And to help me elaborate on this subject, we have Daniel Vu from Instagrams at TradCatMen.
Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfoud, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
What is your profession? Saddle up. Lock and load.
Domine Patri et Filii, Spiritus Sancti.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome. You're listening to Fire Away with Carlos Bersabe, brought to you by Catholic Ammo, En Route Books and Media, and WCAT Radio, where we're locked, loaded, and ready for battle with today's hot topics. Howdy, everybody. This is your host, Carlos Bersabe. You're listening to episode 53 of Fire Away. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe via iTunes or whatever platform you are using and give us a great rating. It is truly appreciated and really does help a lot. So let's do a quick recap. On last week's episode, I had on Randall Clare, who, thank the Lord, I was able to catch up with, and even got to discuss one of my favorite subjects, the new evangelization. So if you missed it, be sure to listen to it and many others after you tune into this one, because today we're going to talk about another one of my favorite subjects, what it means to be and what it takes to be a true Catholic man. And I'm very glad to have Daniel Vu from Instagrams at TradCatMen to help me tell you about it and how at TradCatMen helps men embrace authentic Catholicism and masculinity. But before we go any further, let's go ahead and bow our heads in an opening prayer. And Daniel, if you could.
This is a powerful prayer to the Holy Spirit. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. You who solve all problems, who lights all roads so that I can obtain my goals, you who gave me the divine gift to forgive and forget all evil against me, and that in all instances of my life you are with me. I want in this short prayer to thank you for all things and to confirm that I never want to be separated from you, even and in spite of all material illusions. I wish to be with you in eternal glory. Thank you for your mercy toward me and mine. Amen.
Amen. All right. Welcome to the show, Daniel.
Thank you for having me on. It's really an honor to be on this episode.
Oh, man, I'm happy to have you. And so did you want me to call you Daniel, or am I going to call you at TradCatMen, or just TradCatMen?
It really doesn't matter. Either or, it definitely goes both ways.
Sounds good. So I just want to be clear. At TradCatMen, is it only you, or is there's another guy too?
Well, initially when I started off, or should I say we started off, it was myself and another individual. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty details because he works within a certain field of combating human trafficking. And I wouldn't say unfortunately, but he needed more time to commit to that field, and he handed the reins to me. And now it's just myself. But when we started off, it was two people doing it.
Oh, okay. Right on. Well, cool, man. So this is your first time on the show. So the listeners, aside from your numerous followers on Instagram, they don't know you yet. So I'd like to introduce you to the perennial listening audience. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so my name is Daniel Vu. I was born and raised by a Vietnamese immigrant family in Seattle, Washington. I enlisted in the Marine Corps for 4 years active duty, went on 2 deployments, got out. Eventually, I became a private investigator after taking a year off along with doing the Marine Corps Reserve and also running the page of Tradcat Men.
Right on, man. So you bring up the Marine Corps reserves. If I'm not mistaken, you're somewhere right now where the Marines sent you, and it's not a sandbox that people would avoid. Am I correct?
Yeah, I mean, like, I can't complain where I'm at right now. I mean, granted that it's away from the mainland, the cost of living is a tad high here, but I can't complain. It's essentially paradise. Although I do miss my home parish, I do miss being back on the mainland, but I can't complain. I definitely see this as a blessing from God for sure.
So I'm allowed to say where you are, aren't I?
Yeah, I mean, it's not like OPSEC or anything like that.
So for those who are listening, he is sitting right now in Hawaii, for people who are purists in how to pronounce the word. And I'm not joking, I am a little bit jealous. Not to the point of envy. It hasn't gotten to the beard envy level at Catholic Guardians. So I nothing to confess. But brother, the food there has got to be amazing.
Yes, exactly. I can't complain about the Kahlua pork or like the barbecue plates here for sure. Not to mention all the fruits like papaya and the whatnot. It's really nice and sweet over here.
Oh, man, that sounds great. Well, how much longer are you there?
I'll be there until I'd say the beginning of September or so, unless they want to extend orders. And I know for sure, based off of the route that I'm taking, it's not going to be the only time that I'll be in Hawaii. So don't be surprised if you hear more postings from me from Hawaii.
Oh, man, you should take some beach pictures and surfing pictures. I don't know if you surf, but I don't surf. But if I was there, I'd learn how to surf. Man, I tell you, that's some awesome place. I've only been there once. The Air Force sent me there once, and I was on shift for a good bit of my time on the ground. So the only time that I got to see anything was as the sun was rising, and I had maybe 1 or 2 hours of sleep. We ate breakfast, and then it was, we pulled chocks, wheels up, and never really got to experience the culture there, but it would have been pretty awesome, I'm assuming. But that's not why you're here today, man. You're here today because of a situation. And so for the purposes of our situation report, what is the situation?
It's about the crisis that the church is experiencing right now in terms of having real men around, and that I would say all across the board, at least within the mainstream realm of the church, you just notice that there's a lack of young men such as ourselves who are embracing the faith. And if they are, it is at a level where it's not reaching out to other men, but it gives me hope that there is a rising number of Catholic Instagrammers, specifically men who are taking up that realm and just speaking out a very straightforward, if not blunt truth, and that a lot of guys are slowly coming back to the Catholic faith thanks to that call to action, in a sense that a lot of us are putting out there via social media.
All right. So let's frame the problem then. So you were saying the lack of masculinity or something around that sort. So how do we define what masculinity is then, and how do we find what this void looks like, so that our listeners out there are able to see and understand what we're talking about after they listen to the show?
Yeah, for sure. So masculinity, in my own words, it's about being stoic. It's about having order and discipline, which also means a certain level of maturity, in a sense where you as a man know how to take care of himself, uphold himself, and have a standard to maintain for himself. And within the Catholic Church, there seems to be a lack of it. And there's also a reason why there's this sort of derogative term of what's known as the Church of Nice that's just emerging, because there is a lack of order and discipline within the church, and how, like, it seems because of the narrative that was pushed after the Second Vatican Council of, like, men aren't really important anymore, or at least embracing mainstream society's narrative of the future is female. There's this sort of crisis that's going on of having that void, of having that order and discipline that we once saw within the group of saints that we all look up into, for sure.
So when you were saying the narrative after or resulting from Vatican II, you don't actually mean the Vatican II documents, do you?
No, I wouldn't say the Vatican II documents itself, but it was the implementation that occurred afterwards.
Right,
and
right.
Just like, basically it subtly discouraged men from taking on the reins of the Catholic Church from that point on, which explains why there's a lot of times, if you were to go into a regular parish per se, that there isn't that many men around. And if they are, they don't want to be at the church.
Right, and that's definitely, I'm definitely on the same page. I'm on the same page with you there when it comes to that role of masculinity. And, people at that time, it was the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, when they got caught up in the whole second or third wave, or whatever sociologists call the whatever wave feminist movement. And men just ended up abdicating their role in society, and it's really sad. People didn't, with the sexual revolution, people didn't really want to become fathers because they could contracept. Well, if you're not going to be a father, then how is it that you can embrace being a husband, which is naturally ordered to fatherhood, at the natural sense, not necessarily always the biological sense for men out there who biologically can't have, kids. So it's not a dig on you guys, but, being a husband is naturally ordered to being a father. And so when we cut that off, yeah, absolutely, it kind of degraded from there. So describe, aside from men not wanting to go to Mass, describe what it means to be not masculine in today's society. Like, what do you mean by stoic? So you use the specific word. What do you mean by stoic?
So stoic it's not saying hide your pain, but it's basically displaying the fact that nothing adverse or painful is affecting you, in a sense where you be the example to others, to let them know that, yes, it can be painful, but that you have the endurance and the capability and the fortitude to push through. And we could see that in the examples of a lot of saints who went through periods of adversity, yet they persevered because they put their trust in God and trusted that with Him all things are possible. And to have that sort of lack of stoicism per se is that a lot of men out there, or boys, I should say, they don't have that. They sort of embrace that sort of sensitivity, that's giving up very easily, or just not having stoicism, and in a way wearing their heart on their sleeves in such a way that there's no stoicism anymore in a lot of Catholic circles. And that's why a lot of people tend to ask, where have all the real men gone? Because there's just that lack of stoicism, which is a huge factor within masculinity.
For my thoughts on that matter, stoicism doesn't necessarily mean not feeling. So if people ask what I thought, I'd say emotional intelligence is probably how I would couch this.
Exactly.
There are a lot of people out there who just like to feel and just, have this emotional vomit all the time and not learn how to deal with it. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're supposed to stuff down all your emotions, never letting it out, because as we see in Scripture, Jesus wept. Those are very powerful words. It's not saying that you can't have emotions. It's knowing how to have that temperance of emotions, that appropriate amount of emotions given the situation.
Exactly.
And I'm with you with, especially online, people just like throw people just throw a whole bunch of keyboard warriors just tip-a-tapping on the keys, and when they get into real life and they don't know how to interact with real people, all you have is just emotional vomit and diarrhea everywhere. It's terrible. It's stank.
Yep. It's pretty I absolutely agree where you're coming from with that. And it's a little embarrassing to see, especially when you have Catholic within your username or wherever it is on social media. And it's just like, goodness, this isn't masculine for one. And for two, it's ridiculous that they sort of don't have that temperance or that sort of fortitude and discipline in a way to withhold whatever comment that they just typed on. So in many ways, it's a little embarrassing too.
Oh, absolutely. And that's that piece of masculinity that I appreciate you guys, making headway, because in a previous episode 50, for all those who haven't already listened to it, tune in, at Baratus Catholic made a mention of you. And one of the reasons why is because I guess they designed your new crest, and he was really impressed with what you guys were doing. Can you tell? I know he told me his side. I want to hear your side of the story on how that developed.
Yeah, so I will have to say that it will make much more sense to start from the very beginning. So in 2018, I started from the Marine, and as you know, in the military, you have a task and purpose that's handed down to you from on high. So you're always busy and having a mission. And when you exit from the Marine Corps or the military for that matter, you have to find your own task and purpose in your own mission. That was what I really struggled with, was that I struggled with finding my mission after getting off of active duty after my initial enlistment. And it didn't help that I had a habit of living in sin and vice, just like any Marine, typical Marine, I should say, out there. While this is all happening, I get myself into a relationship with this wonderful girl that I got matched up with on Catholic Match, and it didn't occur to me that I was depending on her for my happiness, and as a result, I was placing so much pressure on her that she ended up breaking things off me at a very deep level. But at the same time, it also exposed the fact that I was not living a Christ-centered life, that I needed to find a task and purpose along with having authentic Catholic masculinity within me, because I was lacking all of that when I thought I had so. And in the midst of pain and suffering that I was dealing with after the heartbreak, I did my best to get myself a job and landed a job as a private investigator, and also got back into the Marine Corps Reserves. And while this was happening, I started to do Exodus 90, which is this spiritual exercise for Catholic men in which you live for 90 days of practicing asceticism along with spiritual exercises such as having holy hour every night, taking cold showers, staying off of social media, and also re-examining your life and how you're going about it. One of the beauties of Exodus 90 is that it's subtly encouraging men to embrace traditionalism. And while this was happening, and as I was going through this exercise, I just remembered I met my now friend, and we thought about how, at least on the sort of Catholic masculinity presence on Instagram was very lacking. And if there was, it was just mainly meme pages or reposts from prominent pages that simply just wanted to repost instead of post new content on Instagram. So I'd say around April or so was when we decided, you know what, we definitely feel called to establish a call to action page for Catholic men on Instagram. And if we're lucky, we're most likely going to get at least 200 to 300 followers by the end of April, which was when we decided to launch it and go from there. So it was kind of a bit on the amateur side, but we knew that we had to get launched up this sort of this amateur coat of arms. We typed up a short mission statement and then started to reach out to prominent Catholic Instagrammers or those that had at least 1,000 followers to get our page out. And surprisingly, this took us by complete surprise, but by the end of that week, we already had 1,000 followers. We had a prominent major pages such as the Basic Catholic Church advertising us out there. And we knew that at that point we had to take this mission that we got ourselves into very seriously, because it's pretty apparent that so many men were waiting for someone to take action and just create this sort of call to action page for men to embrace masculinity through authentic Catholicism, in which it's through the traditional route of the traditional Latin Mass, the traditional sacraments, and the traditional way of thinking.
So you said a couple of things there that really piqued my interest. One was you thought you had masculinity already, and then you found out that you didn't have authentic masculinity. What does that mean?
So the masculinity narrative that's being pushed by society per se is that, you got to be nice, you got to be always gentlemanly and do everything to please your partner if you were in a relationship. And the truth of the matter is that's not masculine at all. And yes, you definitely have to be kind and gentlemanly, but you don't overdo it. You don't do it to the point where the other individual feels like they're being pressured along with just not having space for them. And authentic masculinity is that you have a centered life. And in the narrative, not the narrative, but what I push for is having a Christ-centered life in which you focus on God, and that is your true happiness. And by focusing on that, that's how you develop the traits of humility, virtue, stoicism, chastity. Those is what I see is authentic masculinity. And I simply didn't have that. I gave into temptations. I didn't have any healthy boundaries. And it took a breakup for me to realize that I was falling short and that I was not listening to the actual narrative of masculinity, but rather a distorted version of it that's being pushed by people that oftentimes are confused or having problems themselves.
So for me, I thought that you were going to go with the aspect of masculinity that's being pushed by society, that you're supposed to be this chest-beating gorilla womanizer kind of thing. Because back in my youth, especially, that was what we were told that you needed to do and be to be a man. So I thought you were going to go a different route with that, but you went with the, I guess, current, I'm not aware of it, but I guess the current version, which is you're supposed to be some sort of, feckless, henpeck or something. I don't know. That's a new one on me, if that's what masculinity is in today's society. But, because I don't think that, if you want to be an authentic Catholic man, you're not going to be encouraged to sow your wild oats and use up women as if they were objects to be used. You're not going to beat your chest and just embrace violence either. You're going to embrace controlled violence for the sake of self-defense and defense of others. But it's not going to be this frat boy mentality that should be embraced. But like I said, you went a different route, which I thought was pretty interesting. The other thing that you brought up was the concept of tradition and embracing tradition. How does that play into what you mean by masculinity? Because today, there's a difference between big T and small t, and I think sometimes people blur the lines between the two.
So tradition in how it relates to masculinity is that masculinity has order and discipline, and it's about having this structure that gets you on your path to heaven in a sense. And traditionalism, it's not in a sense of, oh, I want to do things that my grandma and grandpa did back in the day, but it's rather upholding a legacy that's been going on for thousands of years, both within a non-religious context and a religious context. So for example, like embracing the traditional Latin Mass, which has been going on for since the beginning of the church, along with just traditional family values such as embracing the single life and making the most of developing your time to either become a clergy member or be a good husband. And if you're married, to be the best, not just the best man, but the best husband and father that you can be. And if you decide to go within the life of the priesthood, then be the best shepherd of the flock that you could be. And those two definitely go hand in hand in my personal observation.
Right. And so when it comes to the Mass, I find that always an interesting topic whenever people bring up the traditional Latin Mass. So what are your sources for learning about this rich tradition? Because I'll be the first one to tell you, like when it comes to the Novus Ordo, I am a Novus Ordo guy by virtue of location, but also because to me it's the same Christ that's being presented, the same Christ present on the altar. However, I also like the Latin Mass because there's some elements of it that, if the Mass is actually understood, elevates the level of reverence. But that's like the part where where I brought up the small t versus big T. Some people, either they don't know the history of the Latin Mass and they think that it dates back unchanged since the founding of the church. But when in actuality, the liturgy has been refined over time. Even in the 1900s, it was still being refined prior to Vatican II. And so I wanted to see what your take was and where you got your sources from and how you're developing your education and relationship with the liturgy.
Yeah, for sure. So when I was doing Exodus 90, I knew that my ordinary form parish, or Novus Ordo parish as we call it, wasn't going to be spiritual fulfilling because there was no sense of order and discipline, and it was basically just a free-for-all attempt at entertainment along with the communal gathering. And when I started looking into the traditional Latin Mass, I was looking at church militant Dr. Taylor Marshall, along with just old videos that were narrated by Venerable Fulton Sheen, which explained the history and the legacy of the Mass. And I knew that I had to make my way to the traditional Latin Mass parish that I now am a member of to witness it firsthand instead of just reading it. And I remember the very first time that I showed up, even despite all the readings that I did and the whatnot, it felt like someone just took a gospel book and whacked it over my head. But at the same time, I just felt that I was at home. I was at a sense of peace, and knowing that this was the truth and this was what I was seeking all this time while I was feeling this sense of emptiness. And as I did my research, I realized that, yes, there were a lot of reforms happening prior to the Second Vatican Council, but they were essentially just add-ons and little tweaks to what has been developing over the thousands of years that the Mass was being celebrated. And just reading from that and realizing that the traditional Latin Mass had a very rich history in how it has this environment of reverence and this out-of-the-world experience was what kept me to keep researching, not just within what I was finding, but also within scripture and sources such as other Catholic Instagrammers that were very knowledgeable in the liturgy when they took it upon themselves to learn much more of why they were feeling a certain way, along with just the legacy that we're taking on from the saints that grew up within that Mass.
So that's where I'm going to continue challenging you, because you said the words that they took it upon themselves to learn more. And I think that's one of the dangers, and one of the dangers that was, very present with the reforms being made prior to even Vatican II. Like, say, for example, I posted a article for you guys to read in our little, rosary group in Instagram, and in there was, confirmed some of the things that I read when I was getting my master's many years ago in theology, where it talked about the dialogue mass, how in the Latin Mass previous, there was very little for the congregation to do other than just sit there. And then slowly they started to incorporate more dialogue to where we would pray even the Pater Noster together. But that wasn't until around 1920 or something that happened. And that's the point, is that unless you take it upon yourself, unless there's good catechesis, you're just a warm body in a chair. And I'm not entirely sure that that's what you should be doing at Mass. If people are just showing up and you're a warm body in a chair in the pew, is that the type of tradition that we're trying to promote? Because that certainly seemed to be the case in a lot of the observations of that time and place before Vatican II.
Yeah, to go off of that, I think, so prior to Vatican II, the Mass, as the way that people saw it, was the norm, so they didn't see it from a deeper perspective that our generation sees from it for now, because they didn't take it seriously. So that's why they had those dialogue masses along with just certain experimentations come in. And that's not to say that I would just be like, oh, I'm going to this Mass because I feel, et cetera, but it's also having those that have the knowledge through strong catechesis from what it was previously taught, such as the Baltimore Catechism, that explains more in depth the reason why we say certain prayers, the reason why that there's certain order and discipline that simply cannot remain unchanged, and that it's looked at that depth. And that's why a lot of individuals that have knowledge or turn to traditionalism, especially with the traditional Latin Mass, is because they look into that perspective and they look at that deeper level instead of just the surface of what they see. And if an individual was to just see things from the surface and do it just cause, but they don't embrace the in-depth part of it, then that's what I would like to borrow from an Instagrammer called Catholic Samurai, is tourist Catholicism, in which you only go to a traditional Latin Mass, or you only embrace traditionalism because of the aesthetics of it, or like the cosmetic appearance of it, rather than the reasons behind it. And I know that I personally have made that mistake of just seeing things from the surface, but it wasn't until I started looking more in depth of it, looking at more of the scriptures and teachings from the doctors of the church, from those such as like Dr. Taylor Marshall, was when I started to take my faith more seriously in the process.
All right, so I know that you bring him up again, but for me, I don't know. Maybe I just don't have this cult of personality kind of thing where I'm a fanboy of anybody. I don't have, like I said in previous podcasts, I don't have anything against the guy. But for me, I can read myself. And so, like, say, for example, the Baltimore Catechism. It's actually not as detailed as even today's catechism. But today's catechism is shunned by a lot of traditionalists, because they say that it's filled with Vatican II mistakes. And that's the part where, for me, most of the people I hear say that actually haven't read all the documents of Vatican II top to bottom at all, or even more than once. And so for me, that aspect of catechesis, taking it upon yourself, going back to my earlier point, taking it upon yourself, these folks back in the day, they had access to this, but they still didn't avail themselves to this, because the tradition that they were holding on to was the tradition that you just explained, was a very dry and disconnected tradition from the sacred tradition that we're supposed to uphold. And so that's, before anyone starts going, hey, today's liturgy, like I'm gonna continue foot stomping, and I'm gonna go back to the Novus Ordo. So then, are you suggesting that true Catholic masculinity cannot be fostered if a man is attending Novus Ordo masses?
I would say that the typical Novus Ordo mass, then no, because just the ambiguity of how it's run in a typical parish today, it's not fostered, and you see it in the parish. Like, a majority of them those sitting in the pew tend to be old women, and the smaller percentages, and I would say it's split, is a smaller amount of older men that obviously don't want to be there, and maybe a husband and wife that are there just cause, and they might have a kid or so, compared to, say, a traditional Latin Mass parish where the ratio is pretty balanced, and a lot of those that are sitting in the pew happen to not only be men, but they happen to be those that have families or those that are aspiring to have families. And that's not to say that I would disregard the Novus Ordo Mass altogether. Granted, if it was held with the utmost reverence and doing things in accordance with how it's supposed to run by the rubrics of Pope Paul VI, and done with things such as ad orientem, or facing away from the people and facing God, then yes, it could possibly be fostered in the Novus Ordo. However, in what the Novus Ordo that we typically see today, I don't think that masculinity will be fostered within a Novus Ordo parish that just goes haywire.
So that's a lot for me. That's a lot of very, I don't know that I agree necessarily with those types of observations. It's very, like, these are things that you've seen, but I don't think that's across the board. Even in Novus Ordo masses that fall into that trap, as you say, of almost, of not being as reverent, because masculinity, for me, I'm going to give my definition now. Masculinity is loving like Christ. So if at this Mass, because Christ is still present, you haven't yet told me that Christ isn't present at a Novus Ordo Mass. So I'm going to assume that the Eucharist is still the same Eucharist that's celebrated, correct?
Yes, exactly.
So if Christ is still present, then that aspect of Christ-like Christian masculinity, Catholic masculinity, it can be fostered, but it's with the predication that it has to be preceded by this understanding of what the liturgy is supposed to be, the celebration of the Eucharist, the sacrifice of the Lamb, the wedding supper of the Lamb. It has to have that understanding, because I could go just as easily to a traditional Latin Mass and find folks who, just like you said, are there because of the aesthetics and not there because of the true tradition. And I would argue that those folks would also could be accused of lacking that true Catholic masculinity. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know exactly where you're coming from and what you mean, but if you were to also look at, say, like the language of both of those masses, the difference is night and day. And I do agree that masculinity is loving like Christ, for sure. I don't disagree with that. But to go back to what you were saying about the Novus Ordo, in which you can, in a sense, foster masculinity, how I see it is that if it had the utmost reverence, if it had order and discipline, then yes, you could definitely foster masculinity in an environment like that. But if it's in a typical environment where it's a clown mass, for example, or like a puppet mass.
How often do those happen, honestly, though? I mean, we hear about them, but I've not seen one or attended one. And come on, those are like the rare super exceptions, and those guys probably actually left the church and aren't actually, upstanding members of the Catholic Church. Those guys are the crazies from the 70s.
Exactly. It is rare, but it's also in the little acts that happen within the parishes where the the sort of catechism is watered down, or those that are, how should I paraphrase, like clergy of the church that basically contradict church teachings, and we see it almost on a daily basis from figures such as like Father James Martin, then that sows more confusion than what I don't see fosters masculinity, for sure. And that was one of the reasons why I left my last parish. And sure, it could be considered a rare unicorn, but it was just that lack of clarity along with just the confusion, and just seeing how it is, in a sense of it's not a sanctuary of God, but rather just like a place of a communal gathering and just entertainment.
Right, and that's definitely wrong at all times. I guess the point that I'm trying to make for I guess my sake is that when we're talking about masculinity and we're talking about the liturgy, it's having that understanding. And so, like, say, for example, you talk about catechesis. It doesn't sound like you're SSPX. I'm pretty sure that you would have told me by now. But I've spoken to plenty of SSPX people, and when it comes to, me asking them to explain the faith, and they should have the same doctrines, technically. I've canvassed their website and beliefs over and over. Whenever it comes down to it, they're still unable to go past the rote memory type of Baltimore catechism, spitting something back that children do. So where's the actual scholarly love of learning about the faith if that's the level of catechesis that I can expect? If I say, if all they can do is, well, ask me why God created me, and then they're going to spit back, it's to know him, to love him, and to serve him. That's not adult catechesis. I mean, and the Baltimore Catechism really doesn't promote it's or any catechism for that matter. You have to go deeper in your faith and read, and not just and don't get me wrong, folks listening out there, I'm not saying don't listen podcasts, because obviously you're listening to this podcast, but there's so much richness in the Catholic Church that is available to you. When people say the writing of the early church fathers, you can literally download the writing of the early church fathers from the internet, or go to the library or wherever and read it for yourself, and read it in the context of the catechism. That's that piece that I think, if you're chasing tradition without really knowing the big T, without having that genuine desire to know more, not just like secondhand, but firsthand, then I think you're still going to be missing out. And that authentic masculinity piece, you should be wanting every day, waking up, going to sleep, falling in love with Christ, regardless of what mass that you're going to. And, oh, by the way, if we do it right, then we can celebrate the same liturgy and not have silly squabbles over whether or not the vestments are okay, or whether or not a woman's veiling, and if she is she committing some great sacrilege, and then just toss her out or put a tissue on her head, or just these silly things. This isn't the same as like, hey, let's bring in a rock band in the church. That's silly too. So it's being able to understand what is taking place, why it's taking place, and how we can make ourselves a sacrifice during that, lifting ourselves up to the altar as a sacrifice for Christ, because that's, we're his bride. I give you me, you give me you. It's supposed to be an exchange of persons. That's how that sacrament works. But anyhow, man, I like our conversation. And I know that there were some folks who asked us questions on the internet leading up to this, because I was actually, very interested in figuring out what people wanted to hear. So we have one from Sanctus Fidelis. Do we, as Catholics, talk too much about the church and not enough about God? What does that mean?
I think I honestly think that if you're talking about the church, then you are already talking about God, and that it goes hand in hand, and you can never talk too much about God through the church.
Right. And for me, when I first read that, it reminded me of the false dilemma or the red herring kind of argument of religion versus faith. Some people are saying that the organized religion piece is not what God intended, and one of my colleagues from back when I was a freshman in college, he likes to troll me on this account, and he'll say, well, that's not what Jesus intended, and now you have a church where it's full of hierarchy, and that's not what was intended. I mean, like, come on. Hierarchy, according to me, that economy, that order is necessarily present if we're supposed to be a body, just like a head in the body. There's order. So I agree with you. If you are talking about the church, then you necessarily have to be talking about God, because the church is both his body and his bride. So thank you, Sanctus Fidelis, for that softball question. And now we have one from the Reala Painter. The Reala Painter. I don't know if I'm saying that right. It says, are you fallen away Catholic family members and friends easier to talk to about the church now that you're basically in the boat, TLM? Has your study and prayer life given you a clarity you're able to proclaim without fear or deference to human respect? I'll let you tackle that one first.
The way that the question is worded, it sounds a tad confusing, but if you want to have your take on it too, like, by all means, like, pipe in. But from my understanding, just from hearing the question that you just read, if it's in regards to articulating the Catholic faith to those that have fallen away per se, then I think that you can definitely show through your example, whether you have a devotion or attending Mass daily and taking your faith seriously, then that's an example that fallen away Catholics could look at and say, well, they are certainly doing something completely different that I wasn't doing when I made the decision to walk away from the church. But other than that, I don't think that it makes it any easier to explain the faith, because fallen away Catholics tend to have this mentality, at least from my personal observation. I know it's not encompassing, but just from me, is that they think that they have all the knowledge of the church that they grew up in. And they, at least from those that I know that fell away, they don't tend to be very accepting, even if they see an example, and that it takes time for them to understand, if not re-embrace what they're seeing from the example of those that typically attend the traditional Latin Mass.
Right. And so my answer to that one was, I guess, I don't know if she's saying that people who don't attend the Latin Mass are, out of the boat. And if that out of the boat, does that mean like the bark of Peter? Because if that's the case, then I really can't answer this question, because I attend whatever Mass is available. If a Latin Mass is available to me, I go to that one. I didn't, but it's never easy to talk with family and friends, regardless, because your family and friends are hard-headed. Like for me, they're going to bring up stuff before I came back to the church. They're going to be like, you're saying this, don't you remember what you were doing so-and-so years ago? And I was like, well, people can change. I mean, that's the whole purpose, exactly. Right? You can't, like, okay, yes, you're right. I am a hypocrite. I was a hypocrite back then, and I'm a hypocrite now. The church is full of hypocrites. In fact, that's how it works, is because it's a hospital for sinners, not a, nightclub for saints. So, yeah, and that's one of the things that make it difficult for me to talk with family and friends, is that they think they know me because they grew up with me, but they can't accept the new me and the everyday new me. So they don't know how yet to tackle that because I think it makes them feel uncomfortable. And with regards to the study and prayer life giving you clarity, yeah, I mean, of course, every opportunity to learn more about your faith should be another reason for you to love God. And if you can be more charitable than theoretically, then yes, you're going to have less fear about what that person what that person thinks and cares about you, because that's the thing. Like, especially, we were talking a little bit about it about Instagram. You have all these folks trying to chime in, and they're going to tell you how less Catholic you are, or how wrong of a Catholic you are, and this, that, and the other. Like, doesn't matter. No, I mean, yeah, maybe your feelings might get hurt a little, but just wash the sand out. It's okay. Yeah, it's online.
Exactly. Yep.
I mean, it's not, and I'm not saying that it might not sting, or, and I'm definitely not saying that it's not annoying. It's very annoying, but it's an easy solution. You turn off your phone, you pick up the rosary, and you get on with your day. That's it. So, and I think you had a couple of questions that were shot over to you, right?
I only had one, but yeah, I definitely could just read it out loud, and you could also definitely chime into. It's like, what exactly is sedevacantism, from Anna, who also happens to attend my parish too over at St. Anne's. Goodness, small world. So sedevacantism is the belief that the chair of St. Peter has been empty since the end of Pope Pius XII's reign, and that any pope ever since Pius XII has been essentially the anti-pope, or one step towards the anti-pope. And those Catholics tend to believe that, like, John the 23rd and St. Paul VI were the reasons why, like, the church is now a wreck, and that, and they say crazy things like St. Pope John Paul II is burning in hell and is a heretic and the whatnot, just based off of his mistakes, and that whoever believes in that is a true Catholic. But I would like to argue with Matthew 16, verse 18, which is the gates of hell. To paraphrase, the gates of hell will never prevail. So are they basically going against what Jesus is saying, that no matter what happens to the church, that it will still prevail, even if it seems that the Pope is, like the Antichrist? And also what St. Catherine of Siena said, in which even if the Pope is the devil incarnate, you have to stay close to his bosom. Again, I'm paraphrasing what St. Catherine of Siena is saying, but it's swearing obedience to the Pope and having that obedience to the successor of St. Peter. Right.
And what's weird for me is whenever folks say that, they typically are insinuating that they're the remnant. And that's actually one of the names that at least one of these groups, because I know SSPX has this rogue group called the Resistance, I want to say.
SSPX Resistance, I know what you're talking about.
Right. And so they have this splinter group, this rogue group that kind of falls into that category because, like we were saying earlier, some folks, they don't go extreme enough, and so they like to set themselves up as the authority, as if they were the Pope, and say that there is no Pope. And so they're really just doing what the same thing that the Protestants were doing, and just setting up their own church. They're even going beyond what the Eastern Orthodox did, and they're just making up their own stuff now. It's very tragic. But yeah, the empty chair, that's kind of, to me, that's kind of sad, because talking about tradition, that's probably one of our more important traditions coming from the early church, is this line of apostolic succession, especially when it comes to the chair of Peter. So to say that chair is empty, just like you alluded to, is to say that the church was defeated. And if, unless somehow, these groups were able to have another pope in some weird way without the authority of the church, which is impossible, that's just not real. That's just not a real thing. So I don't know. But anyhow, you said that was the last question that you had?
Yeah, that was pretty much the only question that I had.
Well, right on, brother. That brings us to the final segment of the show, which is saved rounds and parting shots. So if there was one thing and just one thing that you wanted our listeners to take away from the show, what would it be?
I think that knowledge is power, and that being masculine, it doesn't mean that you achieve a certain point, but that you keep on learning, such as I don't think that I will ever stop learning about my faith. I will always do my very best to continue learning and also seek to get challenged, such as being on this podcast, which had me thinking, wow, I need to see things from a different perspective. I also need to see different arguments instead of just like having rote memorization per se. And that's how you adopt and continue growing in your faith, and also finding that passion to deepen your faith instead of just going rote. It's having that holistic technique per se of how you want to grow in your faith, instead of just like that rote approach that you were saying that a lot of Catholics were doing. And I definitely agree with that. So I would say study your faith in a deep level, not in a rote manner, but in such a deepening way that you're always excited to learn more about the church and your faith, and that it keeps you going until your last breath.
Amen, brother. Well, as is heard in the background, this music is our cue, letting us know that we're out of time for this week's episode of Fire Away, brought to you by Catholic Ammo and also at Tradcatmen. Many thanks to all who are listening, and special thanks to our guest, Daniel Vu from at Tradcatmen. And if you guys haven't already, go to at Tradcatmen on Instagram and give him a follow, retweet. I actually don't know if you're anywhere else, but definitely on Instagram. Go check them out. Thank you so much for your time, brother, and I hope you'll join us again. It was really fun. I learned a lot. And so for a quick recap on episode 53, be a man. Be a Catholic man. Be a true Catholic man after Christ's own heart. We need you. And if you're ever in doubt for how to get there and how to learn about that, go to @TradCatmen on Instagram. But before we finish, let's go ahead and wrap up with a closing prayer. And Daniel, if you could.
Yes, it's a St. Michael prayer. St. Michael, the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly hosts, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all evil spirits who prowl about the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Amen.
Amen. For more thought-provoking, soul-enriching content, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter under @CatholicAmmo. Again, that's @CatholicAmmo. And be sure to check out more Fire Away at WCATradio.com/Fire Away. This is your host, Carlos Bersabe. Until next Friday, or whatever day I can squeeze in an episode, keep mission-focused and stay locked, loaded, and ready.
Failure is not an option.
Bye-bye, boys.
Have fun storming the castle.
Think it'll work?
It would take a miracle.
Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.